academic paper series through which KEI commissions up to 10 papers each year on various topics of importance relating to the US-Korea relationship. These are broad, diverse topics, including ones like today. And you can find today's paper from this program, including other papers from previous series in this program on our website, keia.org, under the analysis tab on our website. We've been pretty lucky recently in these programs. The previous one timed up very well with the Biden-Moon Summit, and that talked about the the Korea's role in the region and the interaction with the US in terms of trying to coordinate Korea's regional policy with the US. And today, just about a month after the P4G summit, where South Korea talked about trying to be a bridge between the developing and developed economies on development and meeting development and environmental goals. We're talking today about ESG, which is a large part of that, which was also included in the Seoul Declaration coming out of the P4G summit. ESG has become a major buzzword in finance in recent years as it becomes more popular, standing for environment, social, and governance. ESG investing is almost synonymous with investing responsibly and sustainably. Korea has used a growing interest in ESG in recent years to its advantage, and our authors and our speakers today will talk about how South Korea can expand its role from just in the peninsula beyond to the rest of the region and be an effective leader for promoting ESG in the Asia Pacific. So first up, I'll introduce Professor William Grimes, who will be speaking first. He's joining us from the Boston area. He is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of International Relations at the Frederick S. Party School of Global Studies at Boston University. His work bridges comparative and international political economy with a focus on Japanese politics and political economy, East Asia regionalism, and issues related to financial policy and financial innovation. He received his BA in East Asian Studies from Yale University, his MPA from Princeton, and his PhD in politics from Princeton University. Next up will be Ye-Chun Lee, joining us from Seoul, Korea. He's a PhD candidate in political science at Boston University. His research focuses on economic statecraft and regional integration in East Asia, and he received his BA in economics from Waseda University in 2017, a master's degree in international relations from Peking University in 2019, and he joined the PhD program at BU in the same year in 2019. So with that, I'll turn things over now to Bill to get us started.
Great. So first off, I want to thank Kyle Ferrier and the Korea Economic Institute for sponsoring this talk and our research. I've long been an avid reader of KEI's newsletters and academic paper series, so it's an honor to be part of this series. And I can also say it's been a real pleasure to work with Kyle and the KEI staff. So we really appreciate this. Ye-Chun and I will be talking today on the subject of assessing South Korea's role in promoting ESG investing in the Asia Pacific. So this may sound a bit esoteric on its face, but Ye-Chun and I are convinced it's actually quite important, both as a policy issue and as a lens into Korean finance and state-society relations. And we'll delve into both pieces of this. So we hope that you, the audience, will be convinced that we're correct by the end of this event. Now, before I turn the microphone over to Ye-Chun to present the bulk of our research, I want to begin with a few points to just frame the presentation and the discussion that will follow. First, as Kyle noted, a few words about ESG finance. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, as he's noted. And ESG finance implies the use of the financial system to advance societal aims that go beyond just profit and loss statements. The environmental piece is probably most widely known among the public in recent years. Environmentally conscious investing, or green investing, has become an increasingly common buzzword that has spawned a variety of financial products issued by both public and private authorities. The G of ESG, governance, is perhaps less well known, but it is a huge and expanding part of the investing world. Some institutional investors have focused on the corporate governance of companies in which they invest for many years, but this has become an increasingly common goal for investors, even in economies like Korea, Japan, and ASEAN, where corporate governance traditionally was more opaque than in the US or the UK. Second, ESG is becoming big business. As case in point, just yesterday, the Financial Times published an article entitled "Investors Pile $54 Billion into ESG Bond Funds in Fiery Start to 2021. So this will not be as fiery, I suppose, as that start, but hopefully it'll illuminate a bit. For developing countries in the Asia Pacific, ESG finance means access to more funding. It also promises better outcomes for infrastructure projects, as well as improving corporate governance and financial market transparency. Third, ESG creates significant challenges of implementation and definition. And we're going to delve into this a bit in the talk. Who decides if a particular company or investment is green or clean enough to qualify as an ESG investment? Governments, rating agencies, fund managers? At the moment, the answer is yes, all of them. And this is a hodgepodge. Also, what should be the basis for judgment or for weighing the trade-offs for companies that combine ESG and non-ESG activities? And of course, what even is the social good? So for example, can an ESG fund invest in a gambling company that is maybe not a social good, but is well managed and uses only renewable energy? I don't know. Right now, there's a hodgepodge of entities that classify ESG investments, but most are based in developed countries and cater to the concerns of developed country investors. And for those of you who haven't been watching, I should also note that the European Union is in the midst of a massive effort to typologize, to categorize what companies and activities count as clean or green. And they will likely end up imposing some of these rules on EU-based financial institutions, investors, and companies, including in terms of the ways that they manage, that they do risk management for investments. So Korea provides an interesting example for several reasons. It has developed one of the Asia Pacific's largest ESG financial markets, and Ye-chan will show you the stats on this. And in the Korean case, with a particular focus on governance. But it has done so in the context of a financial system that still bears many of the hallmarks of developmentalism. And state institutions have been the driving force behind much of ESG's success in Korea. This is reminiscent to me of the rapid development of asset-backed securities markets in Korea after the Asian financial crisis, which was also an important step forward in financial market development, while also being quite dependent on the role of state actors. We argue that Korea can be an attractive model for other Asian economies that are looking to develop financial markets, reduce the environmental and social costs of development, and access a new class of investors. Korean market development has been driven by the preferences of official actors rather than outside investors who may wish to impose outside standards on the country. Clearly, this is an attractive path for the formerly colonized states of Southeast Asia. Second, Korean investors, like the government pension fund, and corporates, for example, in infrastructure projects, can contribute to the development of ESG finance elsewhere in the Asia Pacific as carriers of expertise and training. Finally, I would just like to add that this is another example in which Korea's soft power can extend its influence in middle power diplomacy. The Asia Pacific can benefit enormously from Korea's experiences and funding, creating win-win opportunities all around. So now I will turn this over to Ye-chan, who will present our research, and he'll outline the ways in which Korea's ESG finance markets have developed, its strengths and weaknesses, lessons for Southeast Asian nations, and the potential for Korea to contribute to environmental sustainability and effective governance in the region.
Thank you, Professor, for your very comprehensive introduction. So I'll just quickly share a slide now. Can you see? It's visible. All right. So I'll first begin by tackling Korea's development legacy and its impact on Korea's ESG market growth. And the second, we'll look at the current landscape of the current ESG agenda setting and Korea's role. And third, we'll look at the impact of Korea's investing on developing Asia. And lastly, we'll explore the challenges and opportunities of the current landscape. So our first argument lies in partially attributing Korea's swift ESG transition to its developmental legacy. Korea's development has been characterized with strict control over capital and its allocation to selected industries for growth. And in this process, the state gained structural control over government agencies and affiliated institutions to allow for such policy maneuvers. And as many studies have argued, this legacy has allowed for sustained control over these institutions even after the liberalization policies that were implemented in the post-Asian financial crisis era. And we found additional evidence for these arguments and how Korea developed its ESG market in a relatively short amount of time. So since the National Pension Service, I'll just call it NPS in short now, because it's a pretty long name, implemented the stewardship code in 2017, which mandated that asset managers of the pension reserves adhere to stricter ESG principles, which were also mainly focused on promoting better corporate governance and how they exercise their voting rights. So after this code has been implemented, the market has seen remarkable growth in ESG-related investing. And we argue that this was driven mainly by the government's changed agenda, which is represented by the Green New Deal. So if you look at the governance structure of the NPS, you can see that the investment decisions of the NPS are made by the Ministry of Economy and Finance before final confirmations are made by the President and the Congress. So the NPS's governance structure suggests that its decisions are still very heavily influenced by political understandings, which is proof of the sustained impact of Korea's developmental state legacy. And we focus on the NPS case because the volume of its investments in the Korean market accounts for a very significant portion of the total Korean capital market size. So it obviously carries a very significant ability to change or lead the market. And naturally, the adoption of the code that we just mentioned brought about rapid changes to Korea's ESG market landscape, given its influence, as you can see from the two tables I listed here. So table 1 on the top shows the total Korean ESG market size relative to the total capital market size. And we can see here that there was a huge jump in the market size from 2017. And this trend can also be directly related to the data in table 2, the table below, where we show the changes in the volume of government agencies participation prior to and after 2017. And we can see here again that the government agencies have noticeably increased their commitment to the ESG market since 2017, which demonstrates that these agencies have been driving the market's growth. So why should we focus on ESG market growth and Korea's developmental legacy in influencing this growth? So first, we argue that the ESG market can potentially serve as a new source for development finance in developing economies. The Asian Development Bank estimated that developing Asia will need to invest around $1.7 trillion per year if the region wants to maintain its growth momentum, eradicate poverty, and respond to climate change. But they also mentioned that there's a huge gap in the current level of investments available, with only $881 billion being invested as of 2017. And as the figure here demonstrates, the global ESG market has shown remarkable growth over the past years. And given the evident development finance gap in developing economies, tapping on this new market through better adherence to ESG standards on the developing economy side can potentially fill this gap. But again, doing so would require that corporates in developing economies better comply to ESG principles and global financial standards so that they become eligible for such investments. But the current landscape of agenda setting for ESG principles is dominated by Western economies. And this poses several issues to developing economies in meeting these standards. And one of the issues is that the qualitative nature of ESG-related data makes it super difficult for developing economies to gather the comprehensive level data required for complying to these standards. And standard setting, as a result, also mostly becomes available to private or public entities with sufficient resources and experience in constructing these standards and principles. And this all adds up to make it even more difficult for developing economies to comply to, as those capable are often Western agencies, such as Morgan Stanley, Bloomberg, and others. And this potentially creates a transparency issue that may develop due to cozy relationships that happen between the rating agency and the rated company. So what happens here is that the rating agency may rate a company better than it actually deserves, as they share some mutual understanding. And this creates a larger entrance barrier for developing economies that are just starting to learn how to adhere to these standards. And there's also the preferential bias issue towards bigger companies that can better prepare the complex level of data required for ESG standards adherence. As smaller companies often lack resources and data to write up the reports that demonstrate the level of their compliance, bigger companies may, at least on the surface, look like they are more compliant than others than they actually are. And as a result, they'll be able to attract more investments, and the divide widens as this continues. So in answer to such issues, Korea has been developing its own ESG standards. And while they're still at a very early stage, the standards developed by Korea may potentially provide alternative perspectives to the current landscape, which is dominated by Western agencies. So for instance, Korea's standards have been focused on promoting better corporate governance over other ESG categories. And considering that governance issues are often the biggest and imminent challenge faced by developing economies, and also considering that promoting good governance often serves as the basis for better performances in other categories like social and environmental categories, this approach may actually better fit the needs of developing economies. And furthermore, Korea's developmental legacy, which has allowed government agencies to actively participate in preparing ESG-related data for standards compliance, and also by directly participating in the market, can be a more applicable model for developing economies with limited private sector capacity. That may often require assistance from the state in accessing necessary data in preparing to comply to these new standards. And another way Korea can help drive ESG compliance that we will discuss onwards in countries in the Asia Pacific, especially in ASEAN member states, is by strengthening its own compliance to ESG standards, given its major presence in these markets. So this table shows Korea's increasing financial influence in ASEAN economies. And as this table shows, Korea has been increasing its financial commitments to ASEAN economies over the past years. For instance, Korea's direct investment in ASEAN accounted for approximately 4.3% of the total FDI in the region in 2019. And when you consider that China's portion accounted for only 8%, Korean investors are increasingly becoming one of the most important regional players in these markets. So Korea's internal change, which we have discussed so far, may influence how their assets are invested and voting rights are practiced in markets with high financial involvement abroad as well. So the direct impact of such internal changes was most visible in the environmental category. So Korea has recently announced that it will refrain from building coal-fired power plants in the future. And this was actually after they faced a huge backlash from the global community after deciding to co-finance this coal-fired power plant in Vietnam with Japan. But this still shows that Korea is willing to better live up to these expectations according to global trends. And also based on the Green New Deal, it has released plans to expand green infrastructure investments abroad as well. The Korea Power Corporation, or KEPCO, has announced that it will issue corporate green bonds worth 176 billion won for KRW for both domestic and overseas renewable energy projects. We still have to wait to see the long-term impacts of these changes, but we can already see that Korea's internal change is making impact abroad as well. In terms of governance issues, since the introduction of the stewardship code, there has been an increasing trend of shareholder activism from government agencies regarding better corporate governance. And as this figure shows, the National Pension Service's rate of opposition against board proposals since 2017 has increased remarkably. And this demonstrates its increased commitment to shareholder activism. The NPS has also released annual plans to increase overseas alternative investments, which may, again, transfer the impact of internal changes to abroad as well. But growth in the ESG market regarding the social category has been rather ambiguous. The growth has been focused on increased issuance of social bonds that serve domestic purposes. And also this was a result of an anti-ad hoc pandemic response. So in a sense, we can probably say that this was an anomaly. But this example can also serve as a model for developing economies, which often lack fiscal capacities to fund their ad hoc needs through well-structured bonds that will actually sell. So Korea's experience in issuing these bonds for expanding their fiscal capacity can potentially serve as a model to help developing economies better structure their bonds for their needs. But there are clear challenges that need to be overcome for a sustained development of the Korean ESG market. And we named some here. So first, it's the market growth sustainability is questionable. As we just mentioned, the growth of Korea's ESG market is heavily focused on government agencies and social bonds, which have been issued as part of an ad hoc pandemic response. And this figure shows this market bias. So social bond issuers take up the smallest portion, but their volume of bonds issued by them is the largest. So we can already see here that the market is heavily reliant on a small number of government agencies to drive its growth. So whether this growth will continue is questionable once the pandemic risk is gone. There's also heavy political risk. As this figure shows, Korea's government agency debt is one of the highest among OECD countries, and the opposition party is skeptical to whether this continued reliance on these agencies for funding the growth is actually sustainable. And not to even mention how Korean political parties have been disagreeing on almost every front. So we might actually see a policy backpedaling once the administration changes. But there are also clear opportunities. The global ESG market is growing really fast, and even the opposition party will have to match up to this trend. And also there is a growing interest in increasing Korea's influence beyond the peninsula. So first, better compliance to ESG standards internally, and second, increased financial commitment to regional economies externally holds the potential to put Korea in a leadership position in leading the region's sustainable and responsible investing. So to conclude, we have first argued that Korea's developmental legacy can help it serve as a more applicable model to promoting and helping compliance to ESG principles for developing economies. And we have also further argued that it can also directly influence the regional markets through internal change, given its financial influence. And Korea's success in leading the region can also have a global impact in that it can provide alternative perspectives to the current ESG norm-setting landscape, consequently giving it more diversity. But we have also recognized the limits in achieving that goal, as the current growth relies heavily on the public sector and is also mainly driven by the pandemic response. But with Korea's increasing interest in expanding its influence, represented by the recent New Southern Policy and the global ESG trend, we expect that Korea's interest in the ESG market, and therefore its potential for regional leadership in promoting this market, will persist. And this will help add diversity to the current ESG agenda setting landscape, and also fill the evident development finance gap of developing economies in the region. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that great presentation, Ye-chan. I think it encapsulates much of what you and Bill said in the paper. And thank you very much, Bill, also for teeing that up and the kind words about KEI. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask each of you before turning it over to the audience, but I would like to remind the audience that we do have the opportunity, you do have the opportunity to ask both Bill and Yechan questions. Please send in your questions via Zoom on the bottom of your screen via the Q&A function. But before we get to those, I wanted to ask, like I said, both of you some questions. Firstly, about sort of the key topic related to all of this, which is the broader regional policy. I know we talked originally about this being a paper focused on East Asia and Asia Pacific, but there's something we never really talked about it in the Indo-Pacific context, which carries a lot broader regional strategic baggage with it that the Asia Pacific doesn't necessarily. So, and Yechan, you sort of ended your presentation talking about the regional picture and how ESG can fit more broadly into that. So I'm just wondering how to sort of bridge that gap between the economic side and the larger, for better or for worse, the broader strategic regional policies that have been proliferating, especially in the past few years, and how to sort of harmonize the two, focusing on ESG as part of the South Korea's broader regional strategy, and could that help connect to U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy? So could, I guess there are two parts to this. Could it be done, and more or less, should it be done?
Maybe I should start in on this. So I don't think of myself as old, but it's been a while since I was young. But when I was young, I was very involved in studying Japan's efforts in Southeast Asia in terms of a development strategy that I've argued is actually a pretty nice parallel to the BRI initiative that China's done. So in the late 1980s, Japan was very involved in helping to develop what was then the ASEAN 5 countries through a combination of trade aid, investment, and training. I had the opportunity actually to be involved with a couple of research institutes in Japan that were directly involved in doing things like going in and doing training sessions for Southeast Asian. It was almost always Southeast Asian, then eventually some other Asian, Mongolian and Chinese, finance ministry officials, tax officials, and central bankers, right? And so at the time, Japan was developing, was helping to develop these regions. And I think that looking back, there's just no question that this was a positive thing for the region. But it's also a very positive thing for Japan and for Japanese companies, because they were not only helping to develop a market, and they were helping to build infrastructure that contributed to the development of the regional division of labor that we now think of as standard, right, for these global production networks, which really did begin in many ways in Japan, East Asia, Southeast Asia, excuse me, not South Asia. So that's not exactly, I think, what's going on, but it does carry lessons for what's going on. So the Japanese government was not driving this, but they were interested in making life better for Japanese companies and for contributing to issues like the adjustment to the rising yen at the time. And so using the Japanese examples and building on the successes of Japanese companies and domestic Japanese public finance corporations' success over the developmental period, they replicated that, modified in some ways, but they replicated it in Southeast Asia. And I think it was an enormously powerful thing that ended up being positive for Southeast Asia, positive for Japan, and it was a bit of a counterweight to the Washington consensus, and not 100% successful. So I kind of see this as a bit of a model. That was what grabbed me when Yechan and I were first discussing this work, is thinking about, we know that ESG finance is really important in Southeast Asia. If you talk to the people at IFC or Asian Development Bank or any of these things, they're increasingly focused on making sure that that all of the projects that they fund are going to be ones that conform with ESG principles, whether internal or external. We know that there's a lack of expertise, right? And we know that there's an investor appetite. And so when you put these things together, this is, I think, that very powerful point that Ye-Chan made at the beginning about I mean, this is the classic win-win, but it also is the sort of thing that can run out of control in the same way that that when you see corporate governance principles get fed into investing decisions, and they just drop irrelevant expectations into systems that are different. That can create problems. I'll give you an example. And the reason I have this on my mind is from Japan. So in Japan, there was a lot of criticism by foreign investors of Japanese corporate governance. You know, we don't have enough outside directors, you know, there's too much insider trading, there's blah, blah, blah. And so initially, a lot of these activist investors or you know, even some of the pension funds like California or Wisconsin teachers, they go in and they'd say, well, you know, you don't have enough outside investors. Well, putting in an outside investor doesn't make any difference. Not necessarily, right? Because it's part of a broader ecosystem. And this is precisely, I think, the governance problem that that I see of, you know, ESG financing, which is great, but if you just try to impose certain things into a system where you know, moving one little piece of it isn't going to change the fundamentals, then everybody's just fooling themselves. You haven't made things better on the you know, the local side, and the investors haven't gotten what they think they're getting. And so this opportunity to rethink and to build locally appropriate ideas about what is social financing, right? What is governance financing? I think, you know, maybe we all feel a bit better about a universal definition of environmental, but on those other things, that's actually quite an important point. And I think Ye-Chan's figures in the Korean context show just how much the governance and social part are big, even though we always think of ESG as just environmental, and all the typologies are based on that. So that's my longish answer to your shortish question. And I know I didn't discuss the strategic issue, but let me just say, I think there's a lot of room for everybody in this space. And this is an opportunity for a healthy contest of ideas. And it will be good for Korea, and it will be good for the Southeast Asian countries, not to just have you know, sort of universal, you know, things that got debated inside the EU just get imposed on them because EU-based banks and stuff don't have any choice but to implement.
Would you like to add?
Yeah, maybe I'll answer the strategic part then. Maybe. Thank you, Professor. Yeah, I think I totally agree that this whole increased outreach regarding ESG will end up being positive for Southeast Asian economies. But I just want to mention how this fits in strategically with Korea's cooperation with the US. So recently I read this joint declaration with Korea and the US regarding increased cooperation in promoting development finance in the Southeast Asian region for a free and open Indo-Pacific. But as I was reading, I really figured that Korea was very cautious in mentioning China in the declaration. So although overall Korea's increased interest and investments in ESG will benefit the Southeast Asian countries, and the new Southern policy is part of this, I think Korea will continue to be very cautious in completely strategically aligning with the US regarding the broader strategic goals that the US has in increasing its investments in Southeast Asia. So yeah, that's my take after reading this joint declaration. Yeah, and other papers regarding this. Yeah.
I think
it creates good you know, examples and expectations that will you know, potentially constrain Chinese investment, but it's not an offensive thought at all. And I think that Ye-Chan's point is very well taken. It's not strategic in the sort of, you know, military strategic geopolitical sense so much.
Yeah, it's just everything sort of gets looped in one basket, lumped in one basket, and so after a while, you have to sort of, you're right, to show what is offensive, what is inoffensive, what is there actually space for cooperation on, and I think this is one area where it'd be a win-win all around for Korea to take on this active role. But while we're still talking a little bit on the strategic point, I just wanted to raise a question to Yechan and then sort of follow up to another question about Bill, because it's sort of interrelated. But the paper largely relies on, at least the first part talks about South Korea's developmental state model as something that other countries in Southeast Asia can emulate. But you could also point out, well, the largest strategic competitor for the United States in the region is China, and they also had a developmental state model. So as we think about how is this an alternative to BRI? Is it an alternative to BRI? Is there room for both? Can they, the needs for investment in Southeast Asia are massive. Just what benefits does the Korea developmental state models or the continuation of that model offer that the Chinese model doesn't? And Bill, you were talking a lot about the Japanese model. So how is the Korean model different from the Japanese model? What more does it add? What sort of is lacking? How can it be improved? So trying to do a little bit of comparative analysis here in how the states sort of approach ESG investing specifically, but maybe a little bit more broadly on sort of the fundamentals of the developmental states models in each country.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and maybe probably deserves another paper. But yeah, so I think Korea's unique stance here is that it started off as a underdeveloped economy, a low-income country that developed into a developed emerging economy, right? And it was capital intensive, and there are other very minute differences that Korea and Japan's models share. But I think just from a general sense, the fact that Korea's model was successful as an underdeveloped country to developing to a developed country can serve as a better model for low-income countries in the region. And Korea has been trying to share this experience through its knowledge sharing program, and also through its cooperation with the ADB and other MDBs. Yeah, and regarding whether it can coexist with the BRI, I think regarding the BRI, it's a development finance project, an infrastructure project that mostly tackles providing credit to these countries. And if Korea can provide a more regulatory approach through consultations and technical assistance, I think this can definitely coexist in a nice way. Yeah.
I guess I would say that to get to your point about the Japan comparison, I think that in both the Japanese and increasingly the Korean cases, that what we see, this thing that we call the developmental state is it's more of a historical process than a thing, than a structure. And there are things that we identify as being parts of the developmental state, close state-society relations, a certain amount of control or suasion in the Japanese case over financial institutions, and a more or less coordinated strategy for a lot of the government aid programs. So there's certainly bits of that, but if you look at Korea, back in the classic analysis of Korea of Jones and Sakhong of 1979, called the chaebol the private instruments of state policy, right? And the chaebol are not that anymore. They've really developed in many ways, and the financial system has shifted a lot too. So that what Korea offers is not just a model of how you can develop institutions that are out of a lack of institutions, but also how these things can change over time and how they can operate in a democratic society. And I think Japan offers that lesson as well. It's just you have to go a little further back into the history. And China's developmental state is also changing. And in many ways, I would say there's not, I don't have a particular problem with saying that China offers some useful lessons to the Southeast Asian economies. But what China does not offer 100% is a model for how to handle these things democratically and transparently. And Korea is moving into an era of transparency that it has been, I would say, arguably since the Asian financial crisis. Some people may say a little bit earlier. But this is going to be an essential model, especially for countries that depend on foreign money, right? And that's a valuable aspect of Korean developmentalism as it has developed that I think is really attractive. And plus, Korea is not China. Korea is not. There's a benefit to being the middle power that nobody thinks is going to be a regional hegemon. When I was studying Japan in the late 1980s and down in Southeast Asia, I had people talking about, the development of the new Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. There were real fears that Japan would be dominant. Nobody fears that Korea will be dominant. They look forward to learning from Korea, and we understand that Korea can be, that places like Korea or now Japan can be moderating forces on the push from potential hegemons.
Those are both really helpful answers, and they better help to contextualize Korea and the region and Korea on this topic specifically. So thank you both for that. With that, I'll turn things over now to some of our audience questions. The first one comes from Hamid Hashmand, who asks, what role do chaebol owners need to play for better governance structures? Do they need to weaken their own managerial rights, and are they willing to?
Maybe Yechan, do you want to pick that one up? And by the way, hello, Hamid. Good to see your name again.
Yeah. Hi, Hamid. But yeah, regarding chaebol owners, the fact is that a lot of their shares are owned by the National Pension Service. And if you look at the assets that the NPS holds, you can see that it's the major shareholder in almost all big chaebols in Korea. And given their influence, if, for instance, if these institutional investors insist on better adherence to ESG standards and therefore improvements in corporate governance, then they will have to concur at least to a certain level. And so the sheer impact of these institutional investors have in Korean financial markets actually induces them for better compliance, I think.
And I'm not very good on the details of these things, but it's worth noting that that the chaebol owners have been minority owners for a long time, but they've been able to exert considerable control, not full control, but considerable control through particular structures of shareholding. And some of those rules are being eroded, and some of them are being very much examined by the by activist investors and increasingly by the National Pension Service and others that have signed on to the Stewardship Code. And basically everybody's going to end up signing on to the Stewardship Code because they all want to work with the NPS. The same has happened in Japan. There was no Stewardship Code, and all of a sudden there was a Stewardship Code that had 180 or more, basically every institutional investor in Japan signed on within weeks of the thing being put in place.
Yeah, just one more point to add. Recently, the foreign institutional investors' shares in Korean chaebols has been increasing as well, and especially in Europe, European institutional investors, shareholder activism has been a pretty huge thing for a while. So they've been more active in practicing their voting rights against a lot of board proposals, and you can actually see these data online. So you can see how, although the chaebols still maintain a huge influence, they might lose their leverage to a great extent in the future, I guess. Yeah.
It's definitely an uphill battle, but glad to see some progress being made on that front. Our next question comes from Scott Thompson from Samsung, who asks, some Korean companies would make the point that they've contributed greatly to Southeast Asian economic and social development already via massive investments in infrastructure and production locations like Vietnam. what win-win ESG points would you highlight to such companies to encourage a next wave of development, especially when they might not all rely that much on outside investors for projects in the region?
Maybe I'll pick that one up to start, and Ye-Chun can follow up. So yeah, I think that the South Korean investors have been quite important, and particularly when you look at infrastructural. Well, there's two things: manufacturing facilities being made in places like Vietnam, but also Korean major companies have been very involved in infrastructure projects and construction projects of various sorts, and they have a number of skills and expertise that make them attractive. They're quite a bit cheaper than Japanese companies, but they're approaching that level. It feels a lot like Japan, Japanese companies, and to me in the late 1980s and 1990s. And I'm sorry if I keep repeating that. And Korean companies in general have been quite important. I actually have a former student who's done some work with Korean companies in ODI in Vietnam. So I thought that was interesting that you noted that. I think that there's a lot of opportunities for Korean companies to continue to do so. I think the sustainability question is, where will the funding come from? So a lot of this has been supported by various government financial institutions, in the same way that a lot of Japanese investment in the region has been supported by JBIC, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, and its antecedents. So the question is, I think, what Ye-Chun posed at the end of his presentation, which is, how sustainable is it? Is this growth if right now you get a lot of support from government, right? Where is the money going to come from? And of course, Samsung has a global strategy, right, and global financing and other things. So I'm not really talking about Samsung, but there is this question whenever one looks at financing structures, that if you build it, they will come model, right? Or do you need a pump priming model? And so what the Korean ESG market, as we understand it, is that there really is a pump priming model in which the government financial institutions have been both building and supplying. But at what point does this become sort of a set of expectations and become sustainable? And so we kind of expect that we may be at an inflection point, and that's what Ye-Chun was pointing to. But there's a lot of opportunities in which these sort of initial government efforts then can be supported or cascade out into the private sector. So this is a long answer to the question, but I think that Korea's ability to continue to contribute to these economic growth is a combination of sort of private interest. Does Samsung want to have a production facility in a particular location, and that the infrastructure story. And the infrastructure story is going to be one of these places where that pump priming model is going to be important no matter what. Even when you look at infrastructure bonds that are highly subscribed by private investors, there's always a P to the PPP, the public-private partnership. There always needs to be some role of a government or an official agency or an international organization in doing a backstop of some part of the uncertainty. And so I expect to see something like a continued hybrid model in much the same way that Japan has a continued hybrid model. And hopefully it'll be synergistic, and it'll be in ways that don't exploit the local economies. But I think that this is one of these places where the ESG financing drive has sensitized people, has sensitized investors, has sensitized locals, and hopefully gives the accountability that will ensure that this really is a win-win.
Great. Before we wrap up, I have one last question I'd like to ask you both, and sort of hits on things you were talking about earlier, both of you, on the role of the National Pension Service and the Stewardship Code, and how important that was in sort of jumpstarting start of Chaebol reform in Korea, and was really helpful in Japan as well for corporate governance reform. But you mentioned in the paper a lot about the role the NPS has played in promoting ESG in Korea, but replicating that would be pretty hard for a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, considering the NPS, considering the NPS is the world's third largest national pension service. So is there challenges to sort of replicating the Korean model on that end, and how can they sort of be overcome? How do you make up for the fact that you can't create an NPS overnight in a lot of these countries in Southeast Asia, at least in terms of size?
Yeah, Chan, I have a couple of thoughts, but do you want to start on this one? Talk a little bit about the role of NPS and stewardship code in Korea, and then I'll loop back to the second part of the question.
Okay, sure. So in the paper, we discussed, and we totally agree that the NPS's size is actually the third largest, and is so significant that it was able to drive this sort of change. But we have argued that Korea's model should not only serve as a model, but also can directly influence these ASEAN markets. And I think a really important point that I want to mention, and which also ties in with the question before, is on the NPS's increased interest in alternative investments abroad. So alternative investments mostly come in project bonds. And since the NPS is better adhering to the stewardship codes and ESG principles, and their participation in these infrastructure projects and also in shares in Southeast Asian economies and others, which are the main interests of Korea, may actually induce change from the private sector. So it's a more bottom-up approach. Yeah. But also, I think Professor Grimes has more to say on the public approach and others. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of Southeast Asia, it is worth noting that there are some Southeast Asian countries that have really substantial, public trust funds. So in Singapore and Malaysia, the central provident funds are very large, particularly in Singapore relative to the society. And you have this long history of the government investment organizations like Temasek. In the case of Malaysia, there have been a series of trusts that also used entrusted funds of the government, and have been quite important in industrial policy at various points in the past. So, there wouldn't be a Proton, the Malaysian car project without the Central Provident Fund. And we can say the same about lots of things in Singapore. I'm less familiar with, and I expect that there isn't anything like that, as far as I know, in places like Philippines and Indonesia. I would say that Vietnam has significant ability to mobilize funds. So there are some more antecedents in the region, and also it doesn't necessarily have to be done, primarily through the pension system. And I think that was the point that Yechan was making at the end, which I call the Velvet Underground point. So Velvet Underground, for those of you who are young, was a rock group in New York in the late 60s, early 70s. And it was always said that, not that many people listened to the Velvet Underground, but everybody who listened to the Velvet Underground started a rock and roll band. And so that their influence was enormous. And that is the way that these things have to work. Even in Korea, we focus in on the role of the state. Most of the money is private, right? That is certainly the case in Southeast Asia. And there are a lot of different actors who can bring this in, including official actors like the Asian Development Bank or the IFC or depending on the type of project, right? And BlackRock and all sorts of different forms of money. And basically what we're suggesting is that the pump priming thing can be really important in places that don't have an extensive ESG market already, and that this can transform or can modify the financial markets in those countries to be more environmentally, socially, governmentally positive, and that this will happen through money that's not just coming out of the government, or even coming out of a couple of big companies. The same as we found in or back when I was studying this, the same thing was going on with Japanese investment. You get cascades, right? And I bet, and I'm not gonna, maybe I shouldn't speculate too much, but I think you'll find that even in the Chinese case, with such a big state role, that you get the same sort of cascades with companies and banks sort of following on to do, not to necessarily do what the government asks, but to take advantage of the opportunity that's created by these public financing corporations. So yeah, that in that sense, I have a little more optimism than your question suggested. There are funds that are available, and there are possibilities for moving the needle to how people make decisions about where to put their funds.
Didn't mean to be too pessimistic, was just trying to.
Oh, that's good. I'm in a very optimistic mood today. It's probably because it's the morning.
Well, thank you both. This has been a very fascinating and interesting conversation, and one, I might say very frankly, one that we don't have very often here in DC, talking about ESG investing, and specifically the role of Korea in helping to promote ESG investing in the region. I think your paper is very compelling, and its arguments about why there is a bigger role for South Korea to play here, and there's a lot of potential. And I do hope for those South Korean government officials who are listening in, and for people who are in Southeast Asia who are interested in promoting their own ESG investing, take this to heart and try to help mobilize interest in this, because there really is a lot there, especially when you think about the needs of as Ye-Chan, you pointed out in your slides, about the needs of Southeast Asia moving forward, and climate in general. So there's a lot of really win-win-win all around here. So thank you very much. And I would like to also remind our audience that you can find Bill and Ye-Chan's paper on our website, keia.org, under the analysis tab, under the On Korea Academic Paper Series publication page. So with that, thank you again, Bill and Ye-Chan, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.